It was a rainy night in late October of 2013 when I decided to build a small cabin out near the edge of a forest in southern Oregon. I was 28 at the time, restless, tired of living in the city, and wanted to get away from people for a while. The plan wasn't to make anything fancy, just something simple, small, and enough to keep me dry while I worked on a few projects I had in mind. The land wasn't exactly mine, but it was far enough off the main road and deep enough into the woods that nobody would ever come around to question it. The rain started that afternoon, steady but light, and by the time I parked my old truck at the dirt clearing near the tree line, it had turned into a thick, cold drizzle. The ground was soft under my boots, muddy in patches, and the smell of wet pine and soil filled the air. I unloaded what I had from the truck: wood planks, some nails, a small toolbox, a handsaw, a tarp, and a few other supplies I'd brought along. I had planned to build a small structure that could be done in a couple of nights, something I could come back to over time and expand if I needed to. As the rain picked up, I got to work setting up a rough base using some old pallets and thick boards. The forest was quiet except for the sound of water hitting leaves and the dull hum of distant thunder. I could hear the stream that ran down the hill nearby, louder now with the rainfall. I worked slowly, driving nails into the wet boards with my hands stiff from the cold. Every now and then, I'd stop and look around, the kind of habit that happens when you spend too much time alone in the woods. The trees all looked the same in the dim light, dark trunks blending into each other, branches bending under the weight of the rain. By the time the light started fading, I had 4 short walls half built and a tarp tied over the top to keep some of the rain out. My jacket was soaked through, and the air was getting colder fast. I gathered some dry sticks from under an old fallen log and managed to get a small fire going inside a metal bucket I'd brought. The warmth felt good, but it also made the cabin smell of smoke and wet wood. I sat down on a bucket and ate a sandwich I'd packed earlier, staring at the flickering light as it bounced off the raw boards. As night came, the rain turned heavier. The sound of it hitting the tarp above me was deafening at times, and water began to drip through the seams in a few places. I adjusted it a few times, trying to tighten the ropes, but the wet knots kept slipping. The wind had picked up too, whistling through the trees and making the branches knock against each other. I couldn't see far beyond the edge of my little clearing anymore. The darkness just seemed to swallow everything up. Around 10, I decided to lie down. I had a sleeping bag, damp from the air, and laid it over some old boards I'd stacked as a makeshift floor. My flashlight sat beside me, the only bit of light I had other than the dying fire. I listened to the sound of the rain, trying to relax, but my mind wouldn't stop running. Every noise in the woods seemed sharper in the dark. The creak of trees, the splash of water, the occasional crack from something falling. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a sudden sound that didn't blend with the rain. It was a dull, heavy thud, like something solid hitting the ground nearby. I sat up fast, heart pounding, and turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the cabin, hitting the wet boards, then the small opening that served as the door. The rain was still pouring, and the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. I waited for another sound, holding my breath. Then I heard it again, a faint dragging noise, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. It was hard to tell with the rain, but it sounded close, too close. I got up slowly, grabbing the hammer that was sitting near the fire bucket. My hands were shaking slightly, though I told myself it was just from the cold. I walked to the doorway and aimed the flashlight out into the rain. The beam hit the trees, the ground, and the small pile of lumber near the edge of the clearing. Nothing, but the noise came again, softer this time, like something shifting in the mud. I turned the light toward where it came from and saw a faint shape lying half in the brush. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its legs were bent wrong, twisted, and the side of its body had a deep gash that looked fresh. Steam rose from it in the cold air, and the mud around it was dark. I stared at it for a long moment, my stomach turning. I hadn't heard any gunshots, and it didn't look like it had been hit by a car. Not out here. Something must have chased it, but I couldn't see any other tracks except for the deep hoof marks leading out from the trees. I backed away slowly, went back inside, and closed off the doorway with a few boards. I tried to convince myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a cougar or coyote that dragged it down. But the uneasiness sat heavy in my chest. The rest of the night was long. I couldn't sleep again. Every time the rain softened, I thought I heard movement outside, light steps, like something pacing around the cabin. I'd shine the flashlight through the cracks, but there was never anything there. The fire burned low, leaving the air thick with smoke and the smell of damp ashes. My clothes clung to my skin, and every creak of the boards made me jump. By early morning, the rain finally slowed down. The forest was covered in a thin mist that hung low between the trees. I pushed open the makeshift door and stepped outside, my boots sinking into the wet mud. The deer carcass was gone. Only a patch of trampled ground and some drag marks led off toward the deeper woods. The marks were wide, like something heavy had been pulled away. I followed them for a few feet before stopping. The ground was disturbed in a messy pattern, too chaotic to tell what made it. I decided I'd had enough for one night. I packed up what I could, loaded the tools back into the truck, and took one last look at the half-built cabin. It stood crooked and unfinished, leaning slightly to one side, surrounded by puddles and soaked earth. I remember thinking how small and fragile it looked out there in the open. As I drove back down the muddy trail, I kept glancing at the side mirrors, half expecting to see something behind me. The forest looked calm again, washed clean by the rain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched the entire time I was out there. I never went back to finish that cabin. A few weeks later, I heard from a local hunter that a couple of deer had been found torn apart not far from that same area. He said it was probably a bear or a mountain lion, but when I asked if he'd ever seen tracks, he just shook his head and said no one could find any clear ones. Years later, I sometimes think about that night. The sound of the rain, the quiet woods, the half-built cabin standing alone in the dark. I think about that carcass lying there in the mud and the dragging marks that led away into the trees. I tell myself it was an animal, something explainable, but deep down I know there was something off about it. Something that didn't fit. Maybe that's why I still remember it so clearly. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt, that deep, heavy stillness in the air, that sense that something out there knew I was there too. And that's the thing about being alone in a place like that. You think you're just building something small and harmless, but the woods have a way of reminding you how quickly the line between safety and danger disappears. That cabin's probably long gone by now, rotted away or buried under leaves and moss. But sometimes, when it rains hard at night and the wind starts pushing against the windows, I still think about the sound I heard out there. The dragging, the faint steps, and the silence that followed. I can still feel the cold of that night, the wet air on my skin, and the uneasy thought that maybe I wasn't the only one in those woods after all. It was early October of 2013 when I decided to take a weekend alone in the woods of northern Maine. I'd been working long hours in construction all year, and I needed quiet, no phones, no people, no noise. A buddy of mine had told me about an old trail that led deep into the forest, a few miles off Route 11, where a small cabin still stood from decades ago. It was built by some logger back in the 50s, long before the area was abandoned. Supposedly, hunters still used it sometimes. I figured it'd be a good spot to spend a couple nights. The drive up took nearly 7 hours. I reached the edge of the forest just before dark, parked my truck off a dirt road, and loaded my backpack with food, a sleeping bag, and a small axe. The air smelled sharp and cold, like pine and old leaves. I started walking down the trail with the last bit of sunlight fading through the trees. It was quiet, too quiet, really. No birds, no crickets, nothing but the sound of my boots crunching through dry needles. The deeper I went, the darker it got, the trees crowding in tight like walls. After nearly an hour, I saw it. A small wooden structure through the trees, slanted slightly to one side. The place looked forgotten. The roof was sagging, moss clinging to the shingles, and the front steps were half rotted. I pushed the door open, and it gave a long, dry creak. Inside, dust hung thick in the air. There was a small table, a couple of chairs, and a cot against the far wall. The windows were grimy, covered in spider webs. The smell of old wood and dampness hit me hard. I set my things down and used my flashlight to check the corners. Nothing but cobwebs and mouse droppings. Still, I felt uneasy. Maybe it was the stillness of the place. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just nerves from being alone. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and lit a small fire in the old metal stove. The crackle of wood was comforting, and the warmth filled the tiny room. For a while, I just sat there listening to the fire, the wind moving through the trees outside. Later that night, I woke up to a sound, a faint scrape, like something brushing against the outside wall. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I sat still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, slower this time, dragging along the siding. Then it stopped. I waited another minute before sitting up and grabbing my flashlight. I aimed it at the window, but the glass was too dirty to see much. When I finally opened the door and stepped out, the forest was dead silent. The air felt colder, heavier. I shined the light around the clearing. Nothing moved. I circled the cabin once, scanning the ground. The dirt was soft, and there were faint footprints near the corner. Human, not animal. They led a few feet away from the cabin and disappeared into the leaves. I felt my stomach tighten. Could have been old, I told myself. Maybe someone passed through days ago. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I went back inside, locked the door with the rusty latch, and kept my flashlight on beside me the rest of the night. Morning light made the place seem less threatening. I went outside to look around properly. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, thick with pines and birch. There was an old path leading downhill behind the cabin, almost hidden under years of fallen leaves. Out of curiosity, I followed it. It curved through the trees for about 100 yards before opening into a small clearing. There, half sunk into the earth, was the rusted shell of a pickup truck. The windows were shattered, the tires long gone. I walked closer, brushing off some moss from the door. The license plate was faded but still readable, 1978. Inside the truck bed, there were scraps of old hunting gear. A broken thermos, a torn sleeping bag, and what looked like a rusted rifle barrel. It was eerie, standing there looking at something that had clearly been left behind for decades. Whoever owned it probably used that same cabin once. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day chopping firewood and trying not to think too much about those footprints. But the uneasy feeling never left. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, and rain started to fall hard. The roof leaked in several spots, so I set out pots and pans to catch the drips. The sound of rain on the metal roof grew steady, almost hypnotic. I sat at the table writing a few notes in my small notebook, just things I noticed about the place. That's when I heard another sound, a dull thud from outside, like something heavy hitting the porch. I froze. The rain was pouring, so I could barely hear, but the noise came again, louder this time. I stood up and moved slowly to the window. Through the blur of rain, I could barely make out something dark lying near the steps. I opened the door just enough to look. A large branch had fallen from one of the nearby trees and landed against the cabin. The relief I felt almost made me laugh. I dragged it off the porch and went back inside, soaked to the bone. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the wood made my skin prickle. Around midnight, I caught a faint smell of smoke. Not from my fire, but from outside. I got up and peered through the side window. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of light deeper in the woods, like the glow of a campfire. I stared at it for a long time, but the rain and fog made it hard to tell. Eventually, it faded, or maybe it was never there. I told myself my eyes were just tired. By the next morning, I'd had enough. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, almost suffocating. I packed my things, deciding to leave early. Before heading out, I walked around one last time, checking the area. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind the cabin, near the tree line, there was a small clearing where the ground looked recently disturbed. Mud turned up, leaves pushed aside. It looked like someone had dug there not long ago. A shallow hole, maybe 3 feet wide, half filled again with dirt. I crouched beside it, poking at the soil with a stick. It wasn't old. The dirt was still soft, like it had been moved within days. My heart started pounding as I looked closer. Near the edge of the hole, something thin and pale stuck out from the mud. It looked like part of a shoe sole, maybe rubber. I didn't touch it. I just backed away slowly, the hairs on my neck standing straight up. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started down the trail fast. The trees felt closer now, like they were pressing in on me. Every crack of a branch behind me made me walk faster. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I just sat there for a few minutes, trying to steady my breathing. As I drove back toward the main road, I looked once in the rearview mirror. Through the blur of the trees, I could just barely see the outline of that cabin fading behind me, sinking into the woods again like it was never meant to be found. When I got home later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that hole. Part of me wanted to report it, but what would I say? That I found a patch of dug-up dirt in the middle of nowhere? Still, a week later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the local ranger station in Aroostook County and told them about the old cabin and the disturbed ground behind it. The man on the phone didn't sound surprised. He said they'd check it out. 2 days later, I got a call back. The ranger told me they'd found the cabin, just like I described, but the hole was empty. Nothing there. No tracks, no signs of recent digging. He said the place had probably just settled after heavy rain. I thanked him and hung up, but something about his tone stuck with me. It was too casual, like he'd said that kind of thing before. That was the last time I ever went into those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that faint light I saw in the rain and that hole behind the cabin. Maybe it really was nothing, or maybe someone had been using that place long before I got there and came back after I left. Whatever the truth is, I'm just glad I never stayed another night to find out. It was the fall of 1996 when I decided to take care of my uncle's old farm cabin in southern Kansas. He had passed away a few months before, and no one in the family really wanted to deal with the place. The farm was old, run down in some parts, with acres of dry fields stretching out in every direction. It sat about a mile from the nearest dirt road, surrounded by tall, yellow grass that waved and hissed whenever the wind blew across it. I was 34 then, and honestly, I needed a break from everything. My job in Wichita was suffocating, my marriage was failing, and I figured some quiet time alone would help me clear my head. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. The paint had peeled down to bare wood, and the porch leaned a little, but the inside was cleaner than I expected. There was an old iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a cot pushed against the far wall. I brought only what I needed: a sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, and a box of shells for the .22 rifle my uncle used to keep in the corner. It was more for peace of mind than anything else. The first few days were calm. I fixed a few broken boards, cleaned out the shed behind the barn, and tried to make the place livable again. During the evenings, I'd sit outside and listen to the fields. The silence out there was heavy. No traffic, no voices, just the wind and the faint creak of old wood expanding in the night air. It was peaceful in a strange way, but also a little too quiet. Around the fourth night, I started hearing something strange out in the fields. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I recognized. It came just after sunset, long and low, like something dragging itself through the grass. The first time I heard it, I thought it might have been the wind moving through the fence line. But then I noticed that it came and went in short bursts like footsteps or something heavier. The next morning, I went out to look. I found tracks near the fence, long, narrow impressions in the dirt, almost like shoe prints, but deeper and uneven, as if whoever made them had been walking with a limp or dragging one leg. The weird part was how the prints stopped abruptly near the edge of the property, as if whoever made them just disappeared into the grass. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the ground, maybe the soil being uneven, but something about it didn't feel right. That night, the noises came again. I was sitting inside, reading by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, when I heard the same dragging sound, closer this time. It moved along the porch, slow and deliberate. I could hear the boards creaking under weight. My chest tightened. I turned off the lamp and waited. The sound stopped for a moment, and then came a faint scrape against the window, like something brushing the glass. I held my breath and didn't move for almost an hour. When I finally got up the nerve to look, there was nothing there, just the empty fields under the moonlight. The next day, I found something else that bothered me even more. Near the barn, one of the cows that had been left behind was lying dead, its stomach torn open. At first, I thought maybe a coyote got to it, but the cuts were too clean, too deep. Coyotes usually tear and pull. They don't slice open animals like that. I buried what was left of it behind the barn and decided I'd leave the next morning. But that night, things got worse. I barely slept. The wind had picked up, rattling the tin roof and whistling through the cracks in the walls. Around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging, the uneven footsteps moving around the cabin. This time it was faster, circling the place like someone pacing just outside the walls. I grabbed the rifle and sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the door. I could hear breathing, faint, raspy breathing, coming from the porch. I stayed that way for hours, listening. By morning, the air felt wrong, stale and cold, even though the sun was already high. I stepped outside and saw more prints in the dirt, dozens of them, leading from the barn to the porch and then back toward the field. The ground looked torn up, like someone had been pacing back and forth all night. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I packed my things, loaded them into the truck, and tried to start it. The engine turned over once, twice, and then died. When I lifted the hood, I saw that the battery cables had been pulled clean off. Not cut, pulled. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was exhaustion or just plain fear, but I couldn't think straight. I told myself I'd wait until morning and walk to the main road. But as night came again, I realized how far that road really was, and how dark those fields got after sunset. When the noises started again, they were louder than ever. Whatever was out there was angry now. I could hear it slamming into the walls, scratching the door, moving from one window to the next. I didn't move. I kept the rifle in my hands and sat in the corner, waiting for the wood to splinter. The thing outside breathed heavy, almost wheezing, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Hours passed. I must have fallen asleep for a bit, because when I woke up, The first light of dawn was seeping through the cracks. Everything was still. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The fields were calm again, but near the barn, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The prints were there again, leading straight to the door of the cabin. But this time they were joined by another set, my own. They matched step for step, as if someone or something had been following me perfectly the entire time. The soil was soft enough to show the tread marks, and it was clear. Wherever I had gone the day before, something else had walked right behind me. I packed up again and started walking toward the road. It took almost 2 hours before I saw a passing truck. The man inside asked if I was all right, said I looked like I'd been through hell. I told him my truck broke down and I needed a ride to town. I didn't mention the noises or the prints or the dead cow. When I came back a week later with a tow truck, the cabin door was open, hanging off one hinge. The ground around it was clean. No prints, no marks, no signs of anything. Even the fence that had been broken was fixed, like nothing had happened at all. I didn't go inside. I just hooked up the truck and left. I sold the land that same month to some family from Oklahoma. They said they liked the peace and quiet. It's been almost 30 years now, and I still think about that place sometimes, especially at night when the house gets too quiet. I never figured out what was out there. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a person, maybe something that just lives in the emptiness between the fields. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone, I swear I can hear it again. That slow, dragging step behind me, keeping pace, always a little too close, always waiting for me to stop. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The cabin belonged to my uncle, though he hadn't used it in years. He had mentioned it a few times when I was younger, saying it was built back in the 1970s by him and a few friends, mostly for deer hunting. He said it wasn't much, just a single-room wooden place near a small creek, but it had everything needed: a wood stove, a bunk bed, a table, and a small storage shed behind it where tools and old supplies were kept. I'd been needing some time away from people. My job in Helena had been grinding me down. Long hours, constant noise, the same routine every day. I figured a quiet few days in the woods would clear my head. I packed simple things: some canned food, a thermos, a sleeping bag, my rifle, a flashlight, and some extra batteries. The drive took about 4 hours, most of it on empty roads, and by the time I reached the dirt trail that led toward the cabin, the sky had already started turning pale orange. The air grew colder the deeper I went into the woods. The road turned into a rough track, half buried under dry leaves and loose gravel. The trees on both sides grew thick, blocking most of the light. I finally spotted the cabin, small, dark brown, sitting a little crooked on uneven ground, with a rusted metal chimney sticking out of its roof. The surrounding area was silent except for the faint sound of water somewhere behind it, probably the creek my uncle had mentioned. I parked the truck a few feet from the porch, killed the engine, and stepped out. The quiet hit me right away. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just that soft, almost muffled kind of silence that fills thick woods in autumn. The air smelled like pine, wet soil, and a hint of cold metal. I grabbed my duffel and went up the short steps. The wooden boards creaked under my boots. The door opened after a hard push. The hinges let out a slow, dry groan. Inside, everything was coated in dust. There was a single small window on the left wall, letting in a thin line of golden light. The bed frame was old and had some rusty nails sticking out. The mattress was thin, but I unrolled my sleeping bag on top of it anyway. A wood stove sat in the corner beside a small pile of chopped logs, half of them damp and dark from old moisture. The table had knife marks and burn spots all over it. It smelled faintly of oil and smoke. I spent the next hour cleaning things up a little, sweeping the floor with a broken broom I found behind the stove, and setting my gear down. By the time I got a small fire going in the stove, it was already dark outside. I made a quick dinner, canned chili and some bread, and sat near the window eating slowly. I could hear the steady crackle of the fire and the occasional drip of water outside. The cabin walls seemed to groan a little when the wind shifted. Later that night, when I stepped outside to relieve myself, I noticed how bright the moon was. It hung low between the trees, and everything around the cabin looked almost blue in the moonlight. I could see my breath clearly. I stood there for a while, listening. Somewhere far off, I heard what sounded like a single sharp crack, maybe a branch snapping. It wasn't close, but it made me look around anyway. I told myself it was just a deer moving through the woods, maybe a bear. The next morning, I woke up early. The air inside was freezing, and the fire had gone out. My phone had no signal, which I expected. After some coffee and jerky, I took my rifle and decided to scout around a bit. I followed the creek behind the cabin for maybe half a mile. It wasn't deep, just a narrow stream moving over rocks, cold and clear. The forest floor was soft and uneven. I saw animal tracks here and there, mostly deer and maybe elk. Around noon, I returned to the cabin. I spent the rest of the day gathering firewood, splitting some logs with an old axe from the shed. The work warmed me up. I noticed faint tire marks on the dirt near the tree line when I went to dump old ashes from the stove. They looked fresh, not mine, and not old enough to have been from my uncle's days. I figured maybe hunters had passed through recently. I didn't think much of it then. By evening, a light fog started rolling in. It moved low, curling around the tree trunks. I went inside and locked the door with the rusty bolt. The fire glowed orange, and I sat near it reading an old magazine I'd found under the bed. Around 10, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, more like a slow, careful sound, like someone stepping on leaves. I froze for a second, listening. Came again, closer this time. I turned off the small lantern, leaving only the dim firelight. I stood by the window and looked out, but it was too dark. The fog had thickened, and the trees just looked like shadows. I thought it might have been a deer again, or maybe even a raccoon. I waited a few minutes and didn't hear it anymore, so I went back to the bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. Every small creak of the cabin made me tense up. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to another sound. This time a dull thud, followed by what sounded like soft scraping. It came from the side of the cabin, near the back where the shed was. I sat up slowly, listening. My heart started to beat faster. The scraping continued, slow and steady, like something being dragged across wood. I reached for my flashlight and rifle. When I shone the light out the window, I couldn't see much, just the fog swirling and the faint outline of the shed. The noise had stopped. I waited a few more seconds, then put on my boots and went outside, the rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. The air was colder than before, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. I walked slowly toward the shed, light beam shaking a little in my hand. The ground was wet, and I could smell something faintly metallic. When I reached the back of the cabin, I saw it, a large dark stain across the wooden wall, near the ground. It looked fresh, still wet. I knelt down and realized it was blood, thick, dark, and streaked like something had been dragged past it. I followed the marks a few feet toward the tree line and found more on the dirt, mixed with prints, boots, not animal tracks. There were at least 2 sets of them heading toward the woods. One was larger, maybe a man's, and the other smaller, like a child's or woman's. The marks disappeared after about 20 yards into the fog. I went back inside and locked everything again. My hands were shaking. I sat by the stove until dawn, not sleeping at all. When light finally came, I went out again to check. The blood was still there, dark now, sticky in the cold. I walked farther into the woods, following where the tracks had gone, but they were mostly gone by then, washed out by dew. About 100 feet ahead, I found an old blue tarp half buried under leaves. It had something wrapped in it once, but it was empty now. That was enough for me. I packed up everything I had in less than 15 minutes. The whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear from the trees. When I finally started the truck, the sound of the engine was almost comforting. I didn't look back at the cabin. When I reached town later that day, I went straight to the local sheriff's office. I told them exactly what I'd seen: the blood, the footprints, the tarp. They sent 2 deputies up there the next day, and I got a call later that evening. They said they found what I described, but nothing else. No signs of anyone, no fresh prints, no body. They said maybe it was an injured animal, but I knew what I saw. Those weren't animal tracks. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, my uncle called me, asking about the trip. I told him it was fine, just quiet. I didn't mention anything about that night. But sometimes, even now, when I think about the silence in those woods and that cold fog rolling in, I can still hear that slow scraping sound behind the cabin, the kind that makes you feel like someone's just standing there waiting for you to come outside. And I know, no matter what anyone says, that blood on the wall didn't come from an animal. It was October of 2014 when I decided to take a short break from everything. I'd been working long shifts at a construction site in Arizona and barely slept more than 5 hours a night. I needed a place where I could just shut everything out for a few days. My cousin told me about an old hunting cabin out near the edge of the Kaibab National Forest, way out there, beyond where the paved roads ended. He said no one really used it anymore, but that it still had running water and a small generator. That was all I needed. I packed some canned food, water, and my old .22 rifle just in case any coyotes wandered too close. The drive took almost 6 hours from Flagstaff. The last stretch was nothing but narrow dirt roads and endless pine trees. My phone lost signal long before I reached the cabin. The sun had started to set behind the tree line when I finally pulled up in front of it. The place looked worn out but sturdy. Weathered wood walls, a rusted metal chimney, and a small porch covered in pine needles. There were no other cabins or signs of life for miles around. It felt quiet in a way that pressed into your ears. Inside, the air smelled like old dust and damp wood. The cabin had 1 room and a small bathroom in the back. There was a cot with a thin mattress, a small table, and a single oil lamp hanging by the window. The floorboards creaked with every step. I set down my bag, lit the lamp, and opened a can of beans for dinner. The silence outside was heavy. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind passed through. That first night was fine. The cold crept in after midnight, and I could hear the forest shifting outside, branches cracking under the weight of wind or maybe deer. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of what I thought was someone walking outside. Slow, crunching footsteps moving through the pine needles. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps sounded too heavy. They circled the cabin once, stopped by the window, then went quiet. I held my breath and waited, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. After a few minutes, the sound faded away, and I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. There were prints in the dirt. Not boots, not animal tracks either. Bare feet, human. They led around the cabin and disappeared into the trees. The idea of someone walking barefoot that far out made no sense. It was freezing the night before, the kind of cold that bites through your skin. I told myself maybe some hiker got lost or a local hunter wandered too far. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I spent the day splitting some firewood and hiking a bit around the area. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects. Every sound I made echoed like it didn't belong there. When I came back that afternoon, I noticed something odd near the treeline. It looked like a small pile of animal bones stacked neatly, almost like someone arranged them on purpose. I didn't touch them. I just stared for a while, uneasy, then went back inside and locked the door before the sun went down. That night, I kept the rifle close to the cot. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, but a low, dragging sound, like something scraping across the dirt outside the cabin. Then came the thump against the wall. Slow, heavy, one after another, like someone hitting the outer wall with their hand. I turned off the lamp and sat there in the dark, heart pounding. The sound moved from one wall to the next, circling me. I could hear breathing outside, long, slow breaths that didn't sound right. It was uneven, wet, almost like whoever or whatever was out there was struggling to breathe. I stayed completely still. The sound stopped right outside the window near the cot. I could barely make out a shape behind the thin curtain. Tall, narrow shoulders, standing just beyond the glass. Then the head tilted, slowly, like it was listening. I gripped the rifle, afraid to even blink. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute, it moved away. I didn't hear footsteps, just silence, the kind that makes your stomach twist. When daylight finally came, I went outside to check again. The prints were there. Same bare feet, but this time they were deeper, like the person had been standing still for a while. There were drag marks near the porch too, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground. The dirt under the window had marks like fingernails digging into it. That's when I realized whatever I saw wasn't just a person walking around in the dark. By the third night, I couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump. I sat near the window most of the evening, staring into the tree line with the rifle resting on my lap. Around 10 p.m., I caught movement between the trees. Something was crouched low, moving in jerky motions. When it stood up, I could see it more clearly under the moonlight. It was shaped like a man, but off somehow. The limbs looked too long, and the shoulders were hunched forward unnaturally. The skin looked stretched, pale and dry, like it didn't fit right. It stood there, facing the cabin, not moving. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I just sat there, frozen, staring back. It stayed like that for a long time before it dropped down on all fours and ran off into the woods. The way it moved wasn't human. It was too fast, too smooth, almost like it didn't weigh anything at all. The next morning, I decided I was done. I didn't care how long the drive back would take. I packed everything, doused the lamp, and loaded the truck. But before I left, I took one last look around the cabin. Near the back wall, by the bathroom window, I noticed something nailed into the wood. A small strip of animal hide, dried and cracked, with a few strands of dark hair sticking out. I didn't remember seeing it when I first arrived. I didn't touch it. I just walked back to the truck, started the engine, and drove. For the first few miles, I felt relief. The cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. But the feeling didn't last long. About 20 minutes down the dirt road, I noticed something strange in the side mirror. Someone or something was standing near the edge of the trees again. Same tall figure, same pale skin, just standing there watching the truck. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was coming up. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people and noise. For days after, I kept thinking about the footprints, the sound of breathing outside the window, that shape in the trees. I told myself it was probably just a person, maybe someone living rough in the woods, but deep down I didn't believe it. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the history of that area online. I found an old article from the 1980s about a missing hunter near Kaibab who was last seen barefoot, wandering along one of those same dirt roads. Locals claimed he went mad after staying alone too long in those woods, that he started mimicking animal sounds and walking on all fours before disappearing completely. I don't know what I saw out there, but I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes, late at night, when I take my dog outside, I catch myself looking toward the tree line behind my house. And every so often, I swear I can hear that same slow, uneven breathing coming from the dark, like something that never stopped watching me finally found its way back. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to get away from everything for a while. I had just turned 32, and I'd been working nonstop for years at a construction company in Leeds. My body felt worn down, my head heavy all the time. I needed a break. A friend from work had once told me about a small cabin he used to stay in near the Scottish border, somewhere between Hoyk and Newcastleton. It was supposed to be quiet, surrounded by hills and forest, no traffic, no neighbors, no phone signal. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I left on a Thursday morning, packed light, just food, clothes, a small toolbox, and a jerry can of extra petrol. The road was long and empty, and as I got deeper into the countryside, it felt like stepping out of time. The trees thickened, the air turned cooler, and the road narrowed into a single lane of cracked asphalt. The GPS lost signal about an hour before I reached the cabin, and by then the only sound left was the engine echoing through the trees. When I finally pulled up, the place looked smaller than I expected. The cabin was built of dark wood that had turned gray from years of rain and wind. The roof sagged slightly, and one of the shutters hung by a single hinge. There was no driveway, just a small clearing where grass and mud mixed together under the tires. The air smelled like wet pine and moss. I remember stepping out and feeling that strange silence, the kind that presses against your ears. Inside, it was simple. One room with a small kitchen in the corner, a wood stove, and an old bed frame with a thin mattress. A single window looked out toward the forest behind the cabin. Everything was dusty, like no one had stayed there for a while. There were a few empty beer bottles and an old newspaper dated from 2009. I cleaned the place up, unpacked, and lit the stove to get some warmth. The wood popped and hissed, and the smell of burning bark filled the room. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The first day passed quietly. I spent most of it walking around the forest, following a trail that ran downhill toward a stream. The air was cool and smelled fresh. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in damp leaves. I saw a few deer tracks and what looked like fox prints near the stream. Everything felt untouched. When I got back to the cabin later that evening, the light was fading and the forest had gone almost silent. I made some canned soup on a small gas stove and sat outside to eat while the sky turned a dark orange. That night, I couldn't sleep much. The bed creaked whenever I moved, and the wood stove made random ticking sounds as it cooled. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside. A soft rustling, slow and deliberate, like someone walking through the grass. I stayed still, listening. It wasn't the wind, it had a rhythm to it. Then it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox and forced myself to sleep again. The next morning, I checked outside out of curiosity. The grass near the cabin had flattened in a few spots, like something heavy had walked there. There were a few footprints in the damp earth near the edge of the clearing. They weren't boots, but they also weren't animal prints. Barefoot, maybe. The size looked roughly human. I crouched down and ran my hand over one of them. It was pressed deep into the soil. I looked around the tree line but saw nothing. The forest was still. I didn't like it, but I didn't want to overthink. People hike through here sometimes. Maybe someone had passed by at night. That evening, I locked the door from the inside and pushed one of the chairs under the handle, just in case. I tried reading an old paperback I found in the cabin, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept flicking to the window. The forest outside looked darker than usual. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. The sound was back. Slow footsteps in the grass, circling the cabin. My stomach twisted. I could hear breathing this time, faint but clear. I didn't move, just lay there, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The steps stopped near the window. I waited, holding my breath. Then something brushed lightly against the glass. Not a knock, more like the touch of fingers sliding down. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours until I finally heard the steps move away. When the sun came up, I stepped outside carefully. The morning air was cold and damp. I walked toward the side of the cabin where the sound had been. The window had smudges on it, thin streaks running downward, like someone had dragged dirty hands across it. I followed the footprints again. This time they went toward the trees and vanished in the thick brush. That day I couldn't relax. Every noise made me flinch. I tried walking toward the stream again, but I turned back halfway, feeling watched the whole time. The forest seemed different, quieter but heavier, like something unseen was moving just beyond where I could look. I decided I'd leave the next morning. I packed some of my things that night and kept a flashlight beside me. It started raining just after dark. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something slam against the side of the cabin. Not hard, but heavy enough to make the walls vibrate. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the window. Through the streaks of rain on the glass, I thought I saw movement, a shadow near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't close enough to make out clearly, but it wasn't an animal. It was standing still, facing the cabin. The rain made it harder to see, but it didn't move for a long time. My chest felt tight. Then, as the lightning flashed, I saw it clearly for a second. A man, thin and pale, with something dark smeared across his shirt. His head tilted slightly as if he was studying the cabin. The light faded, and when the next flash came, he was gone. I stayed awake until morning, sitting with my back to the wall, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When the light finally came through the window, I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and ran out to the car. The clearing was muddy and filled with footprints, more than before, circling the cabin in erratic paths. I didn't look back again. The car started after a few tries, and I drove until I hit the main road, not caring about the mud splattering the windshield. My hands were trembling so hard that I had to stop twice to steady myself. When I finally reached a petrol station near Jedburgh, I parked and sat there for almost an hour, trying to calm down. Later, when I got back home, I looked up anything I could find about that area. I found a short local news article from 2010 about a missing man who had been living rough in those woods. They said he'd been seen wandering near old cabins and abandoned campsites. The search had been called off after weeks with no trace found. I never went back to that place again. For months afterward, I kept waking up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. Even now, when it rains and the wind moves through the trees, I still think about that pale figure standing in the dark. And I keep wondering if he had been living out there all along, watching the cabin, waiting for someone to come back. It was early November 2017 when I decided to take a few days away from everything. I had been working long shifts at a warehouse outside Birmingham, barely sleeping, barely eating, just living in a loop. I wanted quiet, real quiet, so I rented a small cabin near the edge of Snowdonia National Park in North Wales. The listing showed it sitting alone in the woods, next to a narrow gravel road that didn't even appear on most maps. The pictures made it look peaceful. Pine trees, mist over the hills, a small lake nearby. It looked like exactly what I needed. The drive there took almost 6 hours. By the time I turned off the main road and started following the long gravel track, the daylight was already fading. The road curved through the trees, rough and narrow, with just enough space for one car. My phone had no signal for the last half hour. The GPS kept blinking and freezing. I relied on the vague written directions the owner had emailed me. Follow the gravel road for about 3 miles. You'll see a wooden sign marked Year Hen Die. That's the lane to the cabin. When I finally saw the sign, it was so worn out that I almost missed it. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow turnoff, hidden between thick pines. It wasn't as clean as the pictures made it look. The wood was darker, maybe damp, and the front steps looked soft and uneven. There was no light outside. When I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me. No cars, no people, just wind moving through the trees and the faint dripping of water somewhere nearby. Inside, it was small but comfortable enough. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a living space with an old sofa and a wood stove. There was a faint smell of mold, the kind that comes from years of damp air and not enough sunlight. I unpacked a few things, lit a small fire in the stove, and ate the sandwiches I'd brought along. By the time darkness fully settled, I realized how isolated I was. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and there were no streetlights anywhere along that road. I remember standing by the window for a long moment, looking at the black shapes of trees against the dark sky, thinking how completely alone I was out there. That first night was uneventful, but I woke up around 3 a.m. because of a noise outside. It wasn't loud, more like a soft rustling. At first I thought it was wind, maybe branches scraping against the side of the cabin. But the sound was steady, deliberate. I lay still, listening. It stopped after a minute. I got up, checked the window, saw nothing but darkness, and went back to bed. The next morning, I went for a walk. The forest was damp and cold, the ground soft under my boots. There was a faint path behind the cabin, barely visible, like an old trail no one had used in years. I followed it for a while until I reached a clearing. From there, I could see a small valley below, with what looked like an old stone cottage far in the distance. Smoke was rising from its chimney. I wondered if someone still lived there. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange near the steps. There were faint footprints in the mud, small, narrow, like a woman's shoe, maybe boots. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin and stopped near the window. I told myself they were old, maybe from the owner or someone who came before me, but they looked fresh. The mud was still wet, and the edges hadn't softened yet. That evening, I tried not to think about it. I lit another fire, read for a while, and made some tea. Around 9 p.m., it started raining heavily, the kind that sounds like hundreds of fingers tapping on the roof. The wind grew stronger, pushing against the windows, and every now and then I thought I heard something moving outside, probably branches or the rain shifting the gutters. I turned off the lights early and went to bed, listening to the rain. At some point in the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew for sure I'd heard something. It was a faint crunching sound, like footsteps moving slowly on the gravel outside. My heart started beating fast. I stayed still, breathing through my mouth so it wouldn't make noise. The steps came closer, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. The silence stretched so long that I began to think I'd imagined it. Then I heard a soft scrape against the window. Just one, like a fingernail dragging lightly across the glass. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the faint shape of the curtains. After a while, I gathered enough courage to get up and look. The rain had stopped. The moonlight was faint, but enough to make out the outlines outside. I saw nothing at first, just the wet trees and my car parked near the steps. Then, for a brief second, I saw something pale move near the edge of the woods. A shape thin, tall, wearing something long. It disappeared behind a tree. I stayed up the rest of the night with the lights on, sitting in the chair by the window. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Around dawn, I went outside. There were more footprints now, muddy ones, circling the cabin, and small smudges on the window glass, like someone had pressed their hands there. By that morning, I'd made up my mind to leave early. I packed my things quickly, loaded the car, and went inside one last time to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. When I came back out, I froze. There was someone standing on the far side of the clearing. A woman. She wasn't moving. She was facing the cabin, not too far from the trees, maybe 20 meters away. She wore a long coat that looked too big for her, almost down to her ankles, and her hair was messy, hanging in front of her face. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, completely still. I don't know how long I stared. My whole body went cold. Then, slowly, I got into the car and started it. I didn't look back as I drove down that gravel road. Not once. I kept my eyes on the mirror, but the trees swallowed the cabin so fast it disappeared behind me. I drove straight to town, stopped at a petrol station, and just sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold the coffee I bought. I told myself it was probably some local woman who lived nearby, maybe someone curious about the cabin. But something about the way she stood there, silent, unmoving, stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I sent an email to the cabin owner saying I'd had to leave early because of unexpected circumstances. He replied hours later, apologizing and saying no one lived anywhere near that property for miles. He said the next nearest house was an abandoned farm over the hill, empty for decades. That night, after I'd driven all the way back to Birmingham and unpacked, I noticed something on my jacket, a small streak of dried mud near the sleeve. It didn't look like my own. It had the faint outline of a fingertip, as if someone had touched me while it was still wet. For weeks after, I kept seeing that image in my mind, the woman standing at the tree line, the pale shape of her face barely visible, the way she never moved. I told no one about it. I tried to forget, but every so often, when I see mud on glass or hear the sound of rain tapping on a window, I remember that place, that silence, that single pale figure watching from the edge of the woods. And the thing that still bothers me most isn't what I saw, it's what I didn't. The direction those footprints led. Because the last ones I saw that morning didn't lead away from the cabin. They led toward the door, and there were none going back. It was early October when I decided to drive through the back roads that led past my ex-husband's old hunting cabin. I hadn't been anywhere near that part of the woods in almost 8 years, not since we divorced. It wasn't even about him anymore, it was about closure or maybe curiosity. I was driving back from a small town west of Boone, North Carolina, where I'd gone to pick up an antique table I found online. The main highway was closed for construction, so I took the long route, a twisting 2-lane road that ran through miles of forest. Somewhere along the way, I realized it would take me right past the turnoff to where his cabin used to be. I told myself it was fine, just a drive-by, nothing more. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The asphalt narrowed, with weeds growing up along the edges. The trees hung over the road, their branches heavy with wet leaves from last night's rain. My windshield wipers made slow, squeaky passes, and every now and then, a squirrel or raccoon darted across the road ahead. There were no houses anymore, no mailboxes, no signs of anyone living out here. I hadn't remembered it being this remote, but I guess when you're younger and not thinking clearly, you overlook how isolated it all really is. When I reached the gravel turnoff, I almost didn't take it. The small wooden sign that used to mark the trail was gone. The path itself looked narrower, almost swallowed by the woods. But something in me, some restless, quiet pull, made me slow down and steer the car in. The gravel crunched under my tires, loud in the silence. The drive to the cabin was only about half a mile, but it felt much longer. The road was rough, with ruts and fallen branches everywhere. The forest pressed close on both sides, the kind of thick silence that makes you aware of every little sound your car makes. The engine humming, the tires grinding over rock, the creak of the steering wheel. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than I realized. When I finally saw the clearing open up ahead, I stopped the car and just sat there for a moment. The cabin was still there, at least what was left of it. The roof had started to cave in, one corner sagging low. The wood siding was gray and split, the windows black and empty. The porch, where I used to sit on summer evenings with a beer and listen to the crickets, was covered in fallen branches and leaves. The steps had rotted through, and one of the support beams leaned at an angle like a broken leg. For a long minute, I didn't move. The place looked smaller than I remembered, and somehow that made it worse. It wasn't some grand old cabin. It was just a rundown box of wood sitting in the middle of nowhere, a leftover piece of a life that no longer existed. But even from where I sat, I could feel that strange heaviness, like the air around the cabin was thicker, heavier than it should be. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe it was memory playing tricks. I got out of the car. The air smelled damp and earthy. My boots sank into the soft ground as I walked toward the cabin. The forest around me was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the slow dripping of rainwater from the leaves. Every step felt louder than it should have been. The front door was hanging crooked on one hinge. I pushed it open carefully, and it gave a dull creak that made my stomach tighten. Inside, everything was coated in a thin layer of dust and mold. The kitchen table was still there, the same one we'd bought secondhand all those years ago. One of the chairs had collapsed. The counters were warped and dark from water damage. There were beer cans rusted along the counter edge, a cracked plate, and an old coffee mug turned upside down with a spider web strung across the handle. The living area looked worse. The couch was shredded from what looked like animals, probably raccoons or rats. The floorboards near the fireplace were warped, the rug soaked through and stiff. I could smell rot in the air, deep and sour. I moved carefully, not sure why I was even walking through the place. Maybe I just wanted to see if anything of mine had survived. I knew he'd stayed here for a few months after we split. I remember he'd refused to sell it, saying it was the only place he had left that felt like his. I didn't fight him on it. We were both tired of fighting. As I stepped into the small back hallway, I noticed the door to the bedroom was open. The smell there was stronger, like damp wood and old clothes. The bed frame was still there, tilted to one side where the floor had sunken. The mattress had black stains spreading through the fabric. I didn't want to think about what those stains were from. On the wall above the bed, I saw faint scratches in the wood. They weren't words, just marks, long and uneven, like someone had dragged something sharp across the paneling. I ran my fingers lightly across one of them. The wood felt soft and swollen from moisture. Then I heard it, something faint from outside. It wasn't an animal sound, more like a dull thud. Then another. It came from behind the cabin, out near the old shed he used to keep his tools in. I froze. The sound wasn't steady. It would go quiet, then come again, muffled, like someone dropping heavy wood onto wet ground. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or a tree shifting. This area was thick with old timber, but my heart had started to pound faster. I stepped back outside. The shed sat about 20 yards from the cabin, almost swallowed by vines. Half the roof was gone and one wall was collapsed. As I got closer, I saw old tracks in the mud, fresh enough that the edges hadn't yet filled with water. Maybe a few days old. Definitely human. Someone had been here. I crouched down, my breath catching in my throat. The prints were from heavy boots, leading toward the back of the shed. I followed them slowly, my pulse in my ears. Behind the shed, the ground dipped a little, and there was an old metal barrel lying on its side. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't rusted through like everything else. It looked newer. When I got closer, I saw dark stains running down the side of it, like something had been poured out. The ground underneath was soft and black. The The smell hit me then, metallic, foul like iron and rot. I stepped back fast, covering my nose. That was when I saw the tarp. Half buried in the dirt near the barrel, torn and soaked, was a blue tarp. Something underneath it made a shape, long, heavy, uneven. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. The smell and the flies buzzing faintly around it told me enough. I backed away, my stomach twisting. My ex-husband had gone missing 5 years ago. They said he'd left town, that maybe he'd gone south or started over somewhere else. But now, looking at that shape under the tarp, I wasn't so sure he'd gone anywhere. I turned and walked fast back to my car. I didn't run, but every step felt too loud, too exposed. When I reached the car, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sat there gripping the steering wheel, my whole body shaking. The cabin looked smaller now through the windshield, like it was sinking into the earth. The shed behind it was half hidden in shadow, quiet again, like nothing had happened. I started the engine and drove away. The gravel sprayed behind the tires, and I didn't look in the mirrors until I was back on the main road. By the time I reached town, my hands had stopped shaking, but my head felt empty. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that day. I didn't call the police, didn't report anything. I just drove home, took a long shower, and tried not to think about it. A week later, though, I saw a short article online. Local authorities had found human remains behind an abandoned cabin outside Boone. It didn't give details, but it said they were investigating. No names released yet. I didn't need the names. I already knew. The cabin had been the one thing he refused to let go of. And in the end, it hadn't let go of him either. I haven't driven that way since. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits my window and the air smells like wet pine, I think about that road, that clearing, that silent little cabin collapsing deeper into the woods, and I wonder how long it will take before nature swallows what's left of him completely. It was early autumn when I decided to spend a few days at my grandma's old cabin. She'd passed away years ago, and the place had been sitting empty since then. It was tucked deep in the woods outside of a small town in northern Montana, about 2 hours from where I lived. I remembered the cabin from my childhood, how it always smelled like cedar and old coffee, how the light used to leak through the cracks in the wood panels in the mornings. But I hadn't been there in almost 15 years. When I pulled up that Friday afternoon, the place looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the siding had peeled away completely, leaving the boards gray and splintered. The porch steps sagged in the middle, and weeds had grown through the gaps in the walkway stones. The whole place looked like it had been forgotten by time. I parked my truck under a big pine tree and sat there for a few minutes, just staring at the cabin. The woods around it were quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees. It was that heavy kind of quiet that you only get deep in the wilderness. No cars, no people, just the faint hum of insects and the rustle of dry leaves. My dog, Scout, a big black shepherd mix, jumped out of the truck and ran straight toward the porch. He sniffed around the corners, tail low, ears twitching. He always acted cautious in new places, but this time he seemed more uneasy than usual. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The furniture was still where it had been the last time I visited. The old wooden table sat in the center of the main room, and the small wood stove in the corner still had a few charred logs left in it. The curtains were stiff with age, and the floorboards creaked under every step. I set my bag on the counter and opened a few windows, though the hinges fought against me. A cool breeze drifted in, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth. I planned to stay for the weekend, maybe clean the place up a bit and relive some memories. My grandma had always kept the place simple. No electricity, no plumbing, just an old hand pump outside for water and a small outhouse behind the trees. I'd brought enough supplies for 2 nights. Canned food, a lantern, a small propane heater, and my sleeping bag. That first night was calm. I lit a small fire in the stove, ate a can of soup, and sat on the porch for a while watching the woods darken. The sky went from pale orange to deep blue, and soon the forest was swallowed by darkness. The only light came from the lantern and the faint glow of the stove inside. Scout lay near my feet, ears perked every few minutes as if hearing something I couldn't. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping in, telling myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far from civilization anymore. Around midnight, I woke up to Scout growling. It wasn't loud, just a low rumble deep in his chest. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the cabin was cold and black. I reached for the lantern beside me and turned it on. The dim yellow light barely reached the corners of the room. Scout was standing near the front door, his body stiff, nose pointed toward the floorboards. His growl got louder when I took a step closer. I knelt beside him and noticed a faint smell in the air. Something musty, almost like rotting wood, but thicker. I figured maybe an animal had gotten under the cabin and died there. That wouldn't have been surprising. The place had been empty for years. I didn't think much more of it at the time. I coaxed Scout back to his blanket, got the fire going again, and tried to fall back asleep. The next morning, I decided to check under the cabin. I crawled around to the back where the foundation was lowest. The ground was damp, covered in pine needles and old leaves. There was a narrow gap between the ground and the base of the cabin, just enough space to see under. I lay flat and shined my flashlight through the gap. The beam cut through the darkness, and I saw what looked like a bundle of old blankets shoved against one of the beams. I thought maybe it was just some trash left behind, but then I noticed the shape. It wasn't just a pile of fabric. It looked structured, round at the top, narrow below. The smell hit me a second later, sharp and sour. My stomach twisted instantly. I pulled back fast and had to stand up to catch my breath. My first thought was that maybe an animal had dragged something under there, maybe even another dead animal. But that shape stuck in my mind. I went back inside to grab a metal rake from the corner. I crawled back to the same spot and used the handle to pull at the edge of the fabric. Took a few tries before the thing shifted. The flashlight beam caught on something pale. For a second, I thought it was a piece of wood, but then I saw the curve of it, the unmistakable shape of a human arm. My body went cold. I dropped the rake and scrambled backward, hitting my head on the underside of the cabin. I just stood there in the dirt, staring at the shadowy space under the floor, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. It didn't make sense. Who would be buried or hidden under my grandma's cabin? After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back inside. I couldn't think straight, but I knew I needed to be sure of what I'd seen. I opened the trapdoor in the floor near the old pantry. I'd forgotten it was even there. It led to a crawl space that my grandma used to store firewood. The smell hit me the moment I lifted the wooden hatch. It was thick and putrid, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat. I held the lantern down into the opening. The space was low and narrow, just a few feet deep. And there, half covered with dirt and old boards, was the rest of what I'd seen. A body. The clothes were rotted, the skin mostly gone, bones showing through in places. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. Whoever it was had been there for years. I sat on the floor for a long time after that, staring at the open hatch. I didn't touch anything, didn't move closer. My mind raced through every memory I had of the cabin, of my grandma, of the people who used to visit. She'd lived alone for as long as I could remember. My grandfather had died long before I was born. She never had many visitors, just a few neighbors who helped with supplies once in a while. I had no idea who this could have been. I packed up and left that same afternoon. I couldn't stay another night there, not with that thing under the floor. When I reached town, I called the local sheriff and told him what I'd found. They sent a couple of deputies up to the cabin the next morning. They confirmed what I already knew. It was a human body, buried under the cabin for years. The sheriff told me later that it looked like the person had been there since sometime in the late 1990s. A few weeks passed before they found out who it was. A man who'd gone missing in the area 25 years earlier. A drifter, they said, someone who used to do odd jobs around the nearby farms. No one ever figured out exactly what happened. Maybe he'd broken in. Maybe something had gone wrong between him and someone he knew. There were no clear signs of violence left after all those years. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. The county ended up boarding it up and putting a notice on the property, saying it was under investigation. I sometimes think about what must have happened there, about how my grandma might have known, or maybe she didn't. I'll never know for sure, but every now and then, when I'm out walking scout at night and the wind picks up, carrying that faint smell of wet wood and decay, I remember that weekend. I remember the creaking floors, the silence of the woods, and the feeling of being watched in a place that should have felt like home. And I can't shake the thought that maybe some things are better left buried, no matter how deep they go. It was late autumn of 2014 when I decided to spend a few days alone in the mountains with my dog, Rusty. I had been feeling burnt out from work, my head constantly buzzing from city noise, and I just wanted quiet, real quiet. I rented a small cabin outside of Pine Hollow, a rural area in northern Montana. It wasn't much, just a single-story wooden cabin surrounded by thick pine trees and a small dirt road that curved down toward a dried-up creek. Rusty, my German Shepherd, was 6 years old then. Smart, loyal, and calm, the kind of dog who always knew when something wasn't right. The cabin looked old but sturdy, the kind of place hunters might use in the off-season. There was a small porch, a fire pit out front, and an old wooden shed out back that leaned a bit to the left. When I first got there, the air was sharp with the smell of pine and cold earth, and the sky had that heavy gray color that told me snow might not be far off. Inside, the cabin had a faint musty smell, like wet wood mixed with dust. There were 2 rooms, one main area with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a back room with a single bed and a narrow window that faced the trees. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up. I didn't mind. I wanted that kind of silence, the kind that presses into your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, fed Rusty, and sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around me. The forest outside looked endless, just black shapes of trees pressing together, swaying slightly under the moonlight. It was beautiful, but there was something about how still it was that made me uneasy. The kind of stillness where even the crickets go quiet. I pushed the thought aside and went to bed, Rusty curling up on the rug near the door. The next morning, I woke up to frost on the windows. Rusty was staring at the door, his ears pointed up. I figured he'd heard some animal outside, maybe a deer or a raccoon. When I opened the door, I saw tracks in the dirt road. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, leading from the main road down toward the creek and then circling back toward the cabin before disappearing behind the trees. The prints looked fresh, maybe from early morning or the night before. I stood there for a long minute, looking at them, the cold biting at my face. It was possible someone was just walking through, maybe a hunter checking traps or scouting, but something about how they circled the cabin made my stomach feel tight. Rusty kept sniffing the ground, pacing near the steps, low growl rumbling in his chest. I decided to let it go for now, but I couldn't shake the image of those tracks looping around where I slept. The day passed quietly. I chopped some wood, made coffee, read a book, and took Rusty for a short walk up the dirt trail behind the cabin. The air smelled like cold sap and damp leaves. Every once in a while, Rusty would stop and look off into the trees, his tail stiff, but I couldn't see or hear anything. Maybe it was just the wildlife moving around. This deep in the woods, sound traveled strangely. By late afternoon, the clouds started gathering, dark and heavy, and by evening it began to rain. The sound of rain hitting the metal roof was oddly comforting at first. I lit the fire again, boiled some soup, and watched the shadows move across the walls. Rusty stayed close to me, lying with his head between his paws, eyes half open. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like someone stepping on wet gravel. I froze, listening. Rusty's head shot up immediately, ears pointed straight. He didn't bark, just stared toward the window. The sound came again, slow, careful steps outside, moving along the porch. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing. The fire had died down, so the room was dim, only faint orange light flickering off the stove. I could hear the rain still falling, but beneath it was that distinct rhythm of footsteps. Then the sound stopped. A moment of silence followed, long enough for my pulse to thump in my ears. I reached for the flashlight on the table and clicked it on, shining it toward the window. Nothing, just the rain hitting the glass. I waited another minute, then slowly stood and went to the door. Rusty stood next to me, his fur bristled, a low growl steady in his throat. I opened the door a crack and aimed the flashlight out into the rain. The beam caught the edge of the porch, the trees beyond it, and about 20 feet away, the faint shape of someone standing between the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. The rain made it hard to see details, but I could tell it was a person. Maybe a man tall, wearing a dark jacket or coat. I froze, my hand tightening on the flashlight. Rusty growled louder, stepping forward, but I held him back. I blinked, and the person stepped backward into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. No sound, no breaking of branches, nothing. Just gone. My stomach dropped, and I shut the door quickly, locking it, pulling the latch down hard. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair with the flashlight in my lap and Rusty pressed against my leg until dawn finally came. When daylight returned, I went outside again. There were new boot prints, deep and clear in the mud, leading up to the porch, then turning away toward the woods. The same tread pattern as before. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone, but it was empty. Just wet ground, mist, and pine needles. I knew then it wasn't just some random hiker. Whoever it was had been watching the cabin. That afternoon, I packed up my things. I didn't even finish the last night I'd planned to stay. Before leaving, I walked behind the cabin one more time. The old shed door was slightly open. I could have sworn it was closed when I arrived. Inside, there was an old rusted toolbox, a couple of broken chairs, and in the dirt, more boot prints. Fresh, pointed toward the door like someone had been standing there, watching the cabin through the cracks in the wood. The drive back down the mountain road felt endless. Rusty sat in the back seat, silent, staring out the window. I didn't see another car the entire way down. When I reached the highway and looked back in the mirror, the outline of the forest looked still and quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. A week later, I got an email from the cabin owner checking if I'd enjoyed the stay. I mentioned the footprints and the person I saw. He told me no one lived anywhere nearby. The closest neighbor was over 7 miles away, and that the old shed had been locked for years. He said maybe it was hunters, but I could tell he didn't really believe that. I didn't reply again. I deleted the email and didn't tell anyone else about it. For months after, I kept waking up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. Even now, when it rains, I sometimes picture that shape standing in the trees, watching, waiting. Rusty still growls at the sound of rain hitting the roof. And every time he does, I can't help but wonder if whoever was out there that night had come back later, maybe after I'd left, walking those same steps around that lonely cabin in the woods, waiting for another person to come spend the night there alone. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin in the northern part of Montana. I had rented it from a man who listed it online as a quiet, off-grid getaway, which sounded perfect to me at the time. I was 32, burnt out from my job, and tired of city noise. I wanted silence, just trees, cold air, and time to think. The cabin was about 4 hours north of Missoula, deep into the forest, where the roads turned to gravel and then to uneven dirt tracks. I remember how the cell service bars faded away one by one as I drove. By the time I arrived, I was completely cut off. It didn't bother me then. I thought it would feel freeing. The cabin itself sat on a slope facing a narrow valley, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight. It was an old wooden structure, dark brown with a tin roof that was rusted along the edges. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, and the air smelled like wet bark and cold earth. Inside, the place was basic but livable. A single room with a small bed, a wood stove, a dusty table, and a metal sink that worked only if I pumped the handle hard enough. There was no electricity, no running hot water, and no signal from anything. Just me, the woods, and the sounds of wind scraping against the trees. The first 2 days went by quietly. I chopped firewood, cooked canned food on a small camping stove, and spent the evenings sitting outside with a flashlight, watching the forest turn darker until it disappeared completely. The nights were colder than I expected. The wind made the branches sway, creaking in a slow, strange rhythm. Sometimes, I heard faint cracking noises far off in the trees, like something heavy stepping on frozen leaves. I told myself it was deer or maybe a bear. I wasn't afraid of animals. I had a hunting rifle in the cabin, and I kept it loaded beside the door just in case. By the third night, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. The first was a set of footprints near the edge of the porch. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, made by boots, not animal tracks. The soil was soft from rain, and the prints led away from the cabin into the trees. I stood there for a while, staring at them, feeling a slow, heavy pulse in my chest. It was strange because I hadn't heard a car, and there was no other cabin for miles. I convinced myself it must have been the man who owned the place. Maybe he came by to check on something. Still, I locked the cabin door that night. The wind picked up around midnight. It made the walls groan slightly, and I could hear loose branches tapping against the roof. Couldn't sleep much. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. A crunch of leaves, faint but clear, somewhere outside. When I looked through the window, all I could see was blackness. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that isolation was making me jumpy. But I couldn't ignore the sound of movement. It wasn't constant. It came in short bursts, like someone walking, stopping, then walking again. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The footprints were deeper now, like someone had been standing near the porch for a long time. My stomach turned a little when I saw another set of prints circling the cabin, spaced far apart, like whoever it was had been walking around me during the night. I looked toward the woods, but the trees stood still and silent. I couldn't see far beyond the first few trunks. I told myself I'd pack up and leave the next day, just one day early. That afternoon, I decided to take a short hike before it got dark. I followed a narrow trail that ran down the slope, thinking I could find a small creek that showed on the map I'd printed. I carried my rifle and flashlight just in case. The air was colder that day, and the forest was quiet in an unnatural way. No birds, no rustling, just wind brushing against my jacket. After about 20 minutes, I came across something strange. There was an old fire pit beside the trail, cold and filled with ash. Next to it, There were empty food cans and a torn sleeping bag, dirty and damp. Someone had been camping there recently. I felt uneasy but curious. The cans looked old, maybe a week or two. The sleeping bag smelled like wet fabric and smoke. I checked around for footprints. There were plenty, going in different directions. I decided to head back before it got late. As I walked uphill, I kept looking behind me. I had that heavy feeling that someone was watching. The woods were too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When I reached the cabin, it was almost dark. I lit a lantern and started a small fire in the stove. The light flickered across the walls, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door's handle had mud on it. Fresh mud, smeared as if someone had tried to open it with dirty hands. My hands were clean. I hadn't touched it since morning. I stood still for a long time, trying to think clearly, but my mind kept jumping from one thought to another. I went to the window and looked out again. The forest was pitch black. That night was worse than any before. Around midnight, I heard slow, heavy steps outside. Not an animal. I knew the sound of boots on wood. It was the porch. Someone was standing right outside the cabin door. I sat up in bed, holding the rifle in both hands, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps stopped. Then there was silence. I waited, barely breathing. The handle didn't move. The door didn't shake. Just silence that lasted too long. After maybe 20 minutes, the steps moved again, this time away from the cabin, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for morning light. When the sun finally came up, I went outside with the rifle ready. The ground was covered with a thin layer of frost, but the footprints were clear. They led from the porch down toward the woods, the same direction as the old campsite I found. I followed them for a while, about 100 yards or so, until they disappeared near the trail. There, beside a tree, was something that made me go cold all over. It was a small pile of clothes, a dirty jacket, jeans, and a pair of boots, soaked and stiff with mud. Next to them was an old knife stuck halfway into the ground. I didn't touch anything. I turned around and walked back to the cabin, packed all my things, and left immediately. My hands shook the entire drive down the dirt road. When I got signal again, I called the sheriff's office in the nearest town and told them what I'd seen. They said they'd send someone to check. 2 days later, I got a call back. The deputy told me they found remains a few hundred yards from the trail. What was left of a man who had likely been living in those woods for months, maybe longer. They thought he'd died sometime in early September, long before I got there. When I told him about the footprints, he said they were probably mine, mixed up with older ones, and that the cold weather had made them seem fresh. But I know what I heard that night. Those steps weren't mine, and they weren't weeks old. I never went back to that cabin. The owner reached out later, asking if I wanted to rent it again next summer. I ignored the message. Sometimes I still think about that night. The sound of those slow, heavy steps outside, and the way they stopped right by the door as if whoever or whatever was standing there had been listening to me breathe in the dark. Even now, when I lie in bed on quiet nights, I can hear that sound again, faint but clear, like boots pressing softly into old wood. It was late October of 1996 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a small cabin I'd found listed for rent on a handwritten flyer pinned to the notice board of a grocery store. It was somewhere deep in northern Montana, a place where the roads seemed to lose interest halfway through and just turn to dirt without warning. I was 32 back then, going through a stretch of quiet years after a messy breakup and an even messier move out of the city. I wanted quiet, some place to think, maybe to write or to just sit in peace without hearing cars or people or sirens all the time. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road that wound through thick pine forest. The trees leaned in close on both sides, blocking most of the light. The sun was already dropping behind the ridge when I reached a clearing where the cabin sat. It wasn't much. Weathered wood, one sagging porch, a tin roof that had turned dull and gray. The air smelled of sap and cold earth, and the only sound was wind moving through the trees. I remember thinking it was perfect in a strange, quiet way. There was no electricity, only a small generator out back and an old wood stove inside. I unloaded my supplies, mostly canned food, some bottled water, a small cooler with ice, a flashlight, a few candles, and a sleeping bag. The cabin had a single room with a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf stacked with old, dust-covered tools and rusted cans of nails. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and every corner smelled faintly of mildew and cold wood. By the time I had settled in and started a fire in the stove, night had already rolled in fast. The forest outside went black in a way I wasn't used to. No city glow, no faint hum of traffic, just complete silence, heavy and absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat when I stopped moving. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence at first. I even found it calming. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It rattled the loose boards on the porch and made the tin roof groan. I was sitting by the stove, watching the fire die down, when I heard a sound outside, something soft and slow, like footsteps in the leaves. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too slow. Then it stopped. I waited, straining to listen. Nothing. Just the hiss of the fire and the faint crackle of cooling metal. I told myself it was probably a deer. They wandered close to cabins sometimes, even brushed up against the walls. But when I looked out the window, I saw something strange. There were faint marks in the dirt, like someone had been walking in circles just beyond the edge of the clearing. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, shining the beam across the clearing. Nothing moved, but I could see the ground clearly now. The tracks were there, human footprints, bare ones, leading around the cabin and disappearing into the tree line. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I stood there for a long time, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, the sound of wind pressing against my ears. After a few minutes, I went back inside, bolted the door, and sat near the stove again. I didn't sleep that night. I just listened. Every few minutes I thought I heard something out there. Leaves crunching softly, like someone walking just out of view. By morning, the footprints were still there. They were small, maybe from a man, but the odd thing was how clean they looked. No shoes, no signs of dragging, just clear outlines of toes and heels in the dirt. I followed them a short distance into the trees before they vanished completely. No broken branches, no trail, nothing. It was like whoever it was had just disappeared into the woods. The second night was colder. The wind had died down, but the air felt heavier, like the forest itself was pressing closer around the cabin. I kept the fire going late and double-checked the locks before trying to sleep. I had just started to drift off when I heard something again. Soft scraping, like nails against wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the small window above the shelf. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, eyes open, listening. Then it came again, slower this time. I turned on the flashlight and scanned the walls. The sound stopped immediately. I waited several minutes before walking to the back window. When I looked outside, I saw nothing, but there were smudges on the glass, smears, like someone had pressed dirty fingers against it. That was enough for me. I decided I would leave in the morning. I didn't care if I had to drive through the night. I just didn't want to spend another hour there. Before sunrise, I packed my bag and stepped outside to load the car. The air was damp and cold, and the sky was a dull gray. That's when I noticed something new. Small piles of stones, stacked neatly in a line near the edge of the clearing. They hadn't been there the day before. There were 5 of them, each about a foot tall, like someone had spent the night building them one by one. I kicked one over and the rocks tumbled apart easily, leaving dark marks in the dirt beneath them. That uneasy feeling in my chest got worse. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anything moving in the woods. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could down the dirt road. Every turn felt longer than before, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I was halfway back to town. Later that day, I stopped at a small gas station. The attendant asked if I'd been camping up north, and I said yes. He told me the area had been mostly empty for years. He mentioned that a few hunters went missing there back in the late 80s, and the Forest Service had fenced off most of the old trails. He said the land used to belong to a man who lived alone out there until he disappeared one winter, leaving his cabin half buried in snow. The place had never been torn down, just left to rot. I didn't tell him I had stayed there. I didn't tell anyone. But that night, when I finally got home, I emptied my bag on the floor and saw something that made my stomach drop. At the bottom of the pack was a small stone, smooth, gray, shaped just like the ones stacked outside the cabin. I didn't remember picking it up, and I still don't know how it got there. I threw it into the trash, but even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that clearing. The gray sky, the silent woods, the footprints circling the cabin. And in those dreams, I always wake up right before I hear the footsteps come back. I never went back to Montana after that. A few years later, I read that the cabin had finally burned down in a wildfire that swept through the area. They said the fire was caused by lightning, but part of me doubts it. There was nothing natural about that place. Nothing supernatural either. Just something cold and wrong that belonged out there, buried deep in the quiet of those woods. Even now, when I hear wine scrape against wood or leaves crunch outside my window, I still think about those footprints. Whoever left them wasn't trying to scare me. I think they were just watching, waiting, maybe wondering why I was there at all. That thought stays with me more than anything. The idea that sometimes the scariest things aren't what we imagine, but what we never get the chance to understand. It was the fall of 2011 when I rented that small cabin near the graveyard outside of Linton, a quiet rural town tucked deep in the English countryside. I was 34 then, recently separated, and I wanted some time away from people. The cabin was old, built in the 1940s, with damp wooden walls and a smell that reminded me of old books mixed with mold. The owner told me it was once used by the caretaker who looked after the nearby cemetery, just a few hundred feet beyond the trees. It wasn't much, just a single room with a rusty stove, a wooden table, a narrow bed, and one window that looked toward the graveyard. I didn't care. I wanted silence, and that place promised it. The first day was calm. I unpacked the few things I brought: some canned food, a blanket, a flashlight, a small radio. The graveyard wasn't large, maybe 30 or 40 headstones scattered across a sloping field, fenced with rusted iron bars. The grass was overgrown and patchy, with mounds of earth showing through. A small stone shed stood at one corner, probably where the tools were kept. The air there always seemed heavier, like the ground held onto the damp longer than the rest of the woods. By the second night, I noticed how quiet the area became after dark. No birds, no whine through the trees, not even the sound of distant cars. Just a kind of thick, hollow stillness that pressed against my ears. The cabin creaked softly when the temperature dropped, and I'd sometimes hear twigs snapping outside. I told myself it was just small animals moving through the brush. A few nights later, I woke up around 2 in the morning. I didn't know what woke me at first. Then I heard it, a slow, dragging sound, faint but steady, coming from outside. It was like someone was pulling something heavy through the dirt. I stayed still, trying to listen, The sound moved around the cabin, close to the back wall, then stopped. I could feel my chest tighten as I tried to breathe quietly. After a few minutes, nothing. Just that deep silence again. I stayed awake the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The air was damp, and a low mist hung close to the ground. I walked behind the cabin, expecting to see maybe drag marks or animal tracks, but the soil was soft and undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anything being pulled. I remember standing there longer than I needed to, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. I told myself it was probably my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. That afternoon, I went for a walk through the graveyard. Most of the headstones were leaning or cracked, covered with moss and unreadable names. The place had that stillness that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there for too long. I noticed one grave that looked newer than the rest, the soil darker and less settled. The wooden marker didn't have a name, just the year 2008. I found that strange, but I didn't linger. Later that week, something else started happening. Around midnight, I'd hear soft tapping noises against the cabin walls. Not from the roof where branches might hit, but from the sides, low to the ground, like someone running their fingers or maybe a stick along the boards. Sometimes it came from one side, then the other. Always slow, never rushed. I would lie in bed, every muscle tense, waiting for it to stop. When I got up to check with the flashlight, there was nothing there. By the 8th night, the tapping had turned into heavier thumps, like dull knocks against the wooden panels. It sounded deliberate, like someone testing the walls. I thought maybe some kids from town found out I was staying there and were trying to scare me. The nearest house was about half a mile away, but still possible. I decided to stay up and catch whoever it was. I turned off the light, sat near the window with my flashlight ready, and waited. It started again around 1 in the morning. A slow, dragging sound coming from near the graveyard, then those same dull thuds against the wall. I waited until it came close to the front, then snapped on the flashlight and opened the door fast. The light cut through the fog, but there was nothing there. The grass was wet, and the ground muddy from rain earlier that evening, but there were no footprints. I walked a little toward the fence line, the cold air biting my face, but the silence was absolute. When I turned back, the beam of my flashlight caught something odd. One of the graves, the same one marked 2008, looked disturbed. The soil around it seemed uneven, freshly shifted. I stood staring for a while, not sure what to think. The next morning, I went to check that grave again in daylight. The earth was indeed uneven, like it had been dug up and refilled carelessly. The ground was softer than the rest of the area, and there were small clumps of soil scattered outside the border. I had a sudden urge to leave the place altogether, but part of me wanted to know what was happening. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard something metallic clatter near the graveyard. It sounded like the gate had been pushed open. Then came the dragging sound again, slow, heavy, scraping through the dirt. I could hear it moving toward the cabin. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears. I didn't move from the bed. The sound came closer, stopping just outside the front door. The floor creaked softly as I shifted my weight. Then silence again. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only a few minutes. When I finally got up and looked through the window, I could barely see through the mist, but I noticed something on the porch. 2 small marks in the dirt, like someone had knelt there. No footprints leading away, just those marks and a small pile of loose soil. I packed my things before sunrise. I didn't care about the rent I'd already paid or what the owner would say. I wanted to leave. As I was loading my bag into the car, I noticed the graveyard one last time through the trees. The 2008 marker was gone. I stared at the empty spot for a long moment before getting in and driving away. I didn't go back to Linton after that. A few weeks later, I got curious enough to search some local archives online. I found a short article from 2008 about a man who had worked as a caretaker near that cemetery. His name wasn't listed, but it said he disappeared one winter night, leaving the cabin abandoned. Locals assumed he fell into the nearby river and was never found. The body wasn't recovered. That piece of information stayed with me for a long time. It made too much sense. The grave marked 2008. The shifting soil, the sounds outside the cabin at night. I never saw anything, never proved anything, but something about that place didn't sit right. I still think about those dragging sounds sometimes, how slow and heavy they were, like someone moving through wet dirt. I wonder if I had stayed just one more night, if I had waited by that door instead of running, whether I would have seen who or what was making them. I haven't gone near another graveyard since. Even driving past one gives me that same tight feeling in my chest. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear that faint dragging sound in my head, steady and slow, just like before. Maybe it's just memory, or maybe when you spend enough time around the dead, some part of that silence follows you back. I'll never know for sure, but I do know one thing. I should have never stayed in that cabin near the graveyard. That place wasn't meant for the living. It was late September of 2016 when I was assigned to a remote ranger station deep inside the northern part of Black Pine National Park in Montana. I was 32 at the time, and I had been working as a park ranger for nearly 7 years. I had done my share of night patrols, storm checks, animal tracking, and search and rescue duties, but this post was different. The Black Pine Backcountry Station was isolated, 23 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by dense pine forest and steep terrain that barely caught sunlight through most of the day. It was the kind of place where radio signals cut out half the time, and once winter came, most of the trails would vanish under snow until spring. The cabin I stayed in was small, built back in the 1960s, just a single room with a metal roof, a narrow bunk bed, a wood stove, and a weathered desk where I kept my logs. The nearest ranger station was over 3 hours away by truck, so most of the time, I was alone. That isolation didn't bother me at first. I'd grown used to quiet, used to the sounds of wind moving through the trees or the crackling of the stove late at night. But after the first week there, something about that forest started to feel wrong. Not in any supernatural way, just wrong in the way a place can make you feel watched even when you know you're the only person for miles. My duties were simple: check the perimeter trails for fallen trees, monitor the wildlife cameras, and record any signs of illegal hunting or fire damage. During the day, I'd take the ATV through the dirt trails and note down anything unusual. It was quiet work. Some days I wouldn't see a single animal. Other days, I'd find fresh tracks or the remains of a deer torn apart by wolves. It was the nights that started to weigh on me, the kind of silence that sat heavy on your chest. No crickets, no wind, no sound at all except the occasional creak of the wood cabin expanding in the cold. The third week in, I started noticing small things out of place. The first was the back gate of the equipment shed left open one morning. I knew I had locked it the night before. Rangers are trained to be meticulous about that stuff. Nothing was missing, though. A few days later, I found boot prints near the north fence line, human prints, not mine. They were large and deep, like someone wearing heavy hiking boots had walked through the wet dirt. But there were no vehicle tracks on the access road, and nobody had checked in through the ranger network. I logged it and moved on, but it didn't sit right with me. A few nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of metal clanging outside. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking something over, but when I looked out the window, I saw the faint outline of the shed door swinging open again. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The air was freezing, and my breath came out white in the beam of my light. I checked around the shed, nothing. No animals, no sign of anyone. I secured the latch again and went back inside. I remember feeling irritated more than scared at that point. Maybe a bear had wandered too close. Maybe the latch was just worn out. By morning, though, I found something else. Behind the shed, near the edge of the tree line, the ground was disturbed. It looked like someone had been digging. Just a small patch, maybe a couple feet wide. The dirt still fresh. I crouched down and ran my hand over it. It was soft and uneven, like someone had done it in a hurry. I didn't have any reason to think it was a grave or anything like that. It could have been an animal burying food, but the idea still got stuck in my head. That day, I hiked further north along the ridge trail to check on one of the remote cameras. When I pulled the memory card and checked the footage back at the cabin, I saw movement around 3 a.m. on 2 separate nights. A figure, human, walking through the trees just at the edge of the camera's range. Too far to see a face, but definitely not an animal. I started locking the cabin door from then on, something I hadn't bothered to do before. I kept my radio close, even though the signal was weak this far out. The next few nights were uneventful, though I barely slept. I'd wake up every couple of hours, listening to the forest. The silence started to sound unnatural, too heavy, like something was holding its breath out there. Then came the night that broke me. It was raining hard, the kind of steady downpour that makes the roof hum. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and I had the stove running hot just to stay warm. Around midnight, the power went out. It wasn't unusual in storms like that. Generator failures were common, but when I stepped outside to check, the generator casing was open, and one of the fuel lines had been sliced clean through. Not chewed, not torn, cut. I felt that same pressure in my chest again, that sense that something was wrong beyond explanation but still grounded in reality. Someone was out there, someone who didn't want me there. I turned off my flashlight to keep from giving away my position and stood there, listening. The rain drowned out most sounds, but every now and then, I thought I heard faint movement in the trees, soft, deliberate steps trying not to make noise. I backed toward the cabin, locked the door, and waited. Hours passed like that. I sat by the window with my flashlight off, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Around 4 a.m., the rain started to slow. That's when I saw it. A dim shape at the tree line. Someone standing still, facing the cabin. They didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, they turned and disappeared back into the woods. By morning, I was running on pure adrenaline. I packed my things, radioed the main station, and told them I was heading back due to equipment malfunction. Took me nearly 4 hours to get out through the washed-out trails, and I didn't stop once. When I finally reached the main ranger post, I filed my report. They sent a small team back to the Black Pine cabin a few days later. What they found made my stomach twist. The ground behind the shed, the same spot I'd seen disturbed, had been dug up again, this time deeper. Inside, they found a torn ranger jacket, a rusted hatchet, and a pile of old tools. The name tag on the jacket had been half rotted away, but the surviving letters matched one of the rangers who'd gone missing from that post years ago, back in 2004. No foul play was ever officially confirmed. They said it was probably an accident, that the old ranger must have fallen or gotten lost, that animals dragged his things there over time. But I didn't believe that. Someone had been staying out there, moving at night, keeping that ground disturbed. Maybe someone who didn't want anyone finding what was buried there. I never went back to that station again. They closed it off the following winter, citing safety and structural decay. But I know the real reason. Every now and then, when I think about it, I can still picture the shape standing out there in the rain, how still it was, how patient it looked. The forest keeps its secrets quiet. It doesn't need monsters or ghosts. Sometimes, it's the silence itself that does the haunting.